Video from my 2016 trip to Cozumel. Cozumel is the largest Mexican island in the Caribbean. It's also the third largest Mexican island overall, with the larger two being in the Gulf of Mexico. The reef structure of Cozumel is quite varied. It can range from beautiful coral heads like you see here to wide, somewhat barren sand flats. Here's an example of what I'm talking about. Generally speaking, these wide, barren sand flats had a much stronger current than the other coral structures. You can see we're moving at a good, 2 or 3 knot pace. It was strong enough that you couldn't kick against it. All of the dives were conducted as drift dives. Here we are at Santa Rosa Wall. I was about 70 feet down, and there was 150 feet of visibility, and yet I still couldn't see the bottom. This is Santa Rosa Wall with a red filter. Here we're at my favorite dive site. This is Palancar Reef. Palancar Reef consists of very, very large columns of coral that are either on rock or on older coral that have grown over the years. In between the columns are little veins of sand, and the bottom in some places was a good 70, 80, 90, 100 feet. Here's us swimming through the columns in Palancar Reef. This had the most abundant life. There were these yellow tube structures everywhere. At the top of the reef, it had rich, rich coral heads with all sorts of varieties of coral. Here's the video of the top with the blue filter on. This was nice because you could start the dive a little bit deeper and then work your way up to the top. And at the top it was 40 or so feet. This is the last dive of the trip. As you can see, it's a big, empty sand expanse. Currents weren't as bad there as they were in other places. There were also a dozen or so swim-throughs. I chose this particular swim-through because it was one of the few swim-throughs that I was able to sit back and wait for the group to go through, and then film the swim-through without getting kicked or having someone silted up sand. It's really important when doing these sort of dives and these sort of swim-throughs that you use a proper frog-kicking technique. You need to make sure that you're not obscuring the visibility of the person behind you. All of these structures were amazing. This was one particular object that I had no idea what it was, so I included it here. It was huge. Much to my pleasure, there were sea turtles everywhere, and there were 3 primary species. There was the standard green sea turtle, which you also see out in California. There was the hawksbill turtle, which looks a lot like a green sea turtle, only its shell's a little dirtier, for lack of better words. The scutes aren't quite as individually identifiable. And the third is the loggerhead sea turtle. The loggerhead sea turtle is so named because its head is massive, and I believe that the last sea turtle in this series is actually a loggerhead. One of the cool things that we saw were sea turtles sleeping at night, but we had to be careful. We couldn't startle them and couldn't shine our lights directly in their eyes, because if we did, it might confuse them. They might think that our lights were the moon and try to head away from them, towards them, and off their point of reference. This, I believe, was the loggerhead. Look at how thick its head is compared to its shell. It's huge, and this was probably the sea turtle that I came the closest to. Note that its shell, you can't really make out the plates as well as with some of the others. There were quite a few different rays and sharks. The small round ray was the one that I saw the most. We saw them in night dives and several other places. This was the most interesting example of mutualism that I saw. This is a small round ray with some sort of jack. I think it might be a bar jack. And I saw several instances of this pairing. The ray would be on the bottom, and this is actually a different type of ray, as you can see. And the jack would hover just slightly above the ray and would shadow it wherever it went. As you can see, there's no more than a few inch gap. And you have to be careful where you kneel down, or you might land on a ray, like you can see here, its eyes. There were also several nurse sharks. This was one of the few stationary nurse sharks that I saw, and this was the closest one that I got to. There were many instances where, as we were swimming along, especially in high current areas, the nurse sharks would be free swimming. This is somewhat rare in my experience, as when I was in Florida and Honduras, the nurse sharks would primarily lay under the reef and just hang out. Nurse sharks are very docile. There's never any danger unless you stick your hand in its mouth. But never a sign of a reef shark, at least on my dives. There were also several varieties of eels. The most common one was the large green moray eel. This looks a lot like the eels that we have back at home in California. I was surprised to find them frequently free swimming here. They were gargantuan. Here's another example of the green moray. This is more what I'm used to, just the head sort of sticking out. I don't know if there was a lobster back there like in California. This is a snake eel, named because of its similarities to a snake, but I can assure you that it's an eel. You can see the two characteristic nostrils at the end of its snout. This is a spotted moray. I believe I only saw these on the night dive. These were much smaller and much more rare than their green cousins. I was fortunate to see these too. Next up, we have the reef fish. Here we have a goatfish. This is probably my favorite fish that I saw. It's called a goatfish because it has these two little barbell fins underneath its chin that it uses to pat the sand for food. When it finds a crustacean or a mollusk, it buries its head in the sand, diving after a morsel. This is a rainbow parrotfish. It was by far the largest parrotfish that we saw. This one's maybe 3 feet long. These are oceanic triggerfish. They stayed on the outskirts of the reef and were mostly found in sandy areas. I'm not sure what this is. It might be a yellow-striped goatfish. It's hard to tell. Queen triggerfish. Here's a barracuda. There were several barracuda all over the various dive sites. They were fun. Here's one of the many flatfish that I saw. This one was a master in camouflage. Now contrast this flatfish to this one, which has sort of blue fringing around the sides. This one was much more ornate and ostentatious. Here's one of the many black grouper that I saw. The black grouper were the largest bony fish that I encountered. In Florida, we saw giant grouper, or Goliath grouper, but here the black grouper were the largest. These are horse-eyed jacks. Again, a fish that you'd see sort of off in the distance. This is a honeycomb cowfish. You can see the two little horns directly over the eyes. This is a flyby of what I think is a spotted trunkfish. Here's an up-close version of the spotted trunkfish. It's related to the cowfish. Here was the juvenile spotted trunkfish that I saw. I was hunting for these with a buddy of mine in Roatan, and he flipped out when we saw one, so here it is, my friend, another juvenile. This was the only porcupine puffer that I saw, but unfortunately it was so far away in the current I couldn't get a better picture. This is a type of filefish. It's a white spotted filefish, and like the scrawled filefish that you see here, it's also related to the pufferfish, the boxfish, the trunkfish, and the cowfish. This is one of the two drum fish that we saw on the trip. The dive guides get super excited when they see these guys. Here's a juvenile. You can see its dorsal fin is really, really elongated. I don't quite understand the excitement. This was just a tiny little pea-sized puffer that I thought was pretty cute. I'm not sure what this is, but I thought it was really beautiful with its striping. Here's a French angelfish. There were French angelfish, queen angelfish. Here we have a yellowtail snapper. Great shot. He came right up to the camera. These are the toadfish. They live in little holes. They have beards and yellow pectoral fins. And they emit a croaking sound if you pay really close attention. This one was pissed that I was shining a light at him. This is a squirrelfish. I saw quite a few more of these in Roatan. This is a feeding school of blue tang. They had this style of feeding where they would roll over the reef and attack barrel sponges or whatever feeding source they wanted. They did the same thing in the open sandy areas as well. It was an interesting sight to behold that wasn't replicated by other fish. This is the one trumpetfish that I saw. I tried to signal to get other people's attention, but nobody was listening. Look at how incredibly blended the scorpionfish is. You really have to be careful because you're not allowed to use gloves. Unfortunately, we did spot one lionfish. It breaks my heart to see these as they destroy the reefs. This was a tiny, tiny jawfish. There were tiny little jawfish spread all over the sandy areas, and you couldn't get too close or they'd duck in their hole. I was able to shoot some great macro photography. These guys were one of my favorite subjects. These are called arrow crabs, and some of them weren't so happy to get their picture taken. This one's sort of giving me a leg to keep me at bay. Super beautiful. They would usually rest in the coral. They were also quite common. Here's a pair that are actually fighting each other. It's kind of hard to see. They were under this coral head, but they were boxing and pinching at each other. Here's one of the only nudibranchs that I saw. I have no idea what species this is, as it was really hard to get focus with the current pushing me away. There was this beautiful type of anemone that was real bulbous that I was able to get some great footage of. Here's that same species of anemone. I've got my macro lens on and my light is sitting at the top of my camera to give it this glowing effect. I thought they were simply stunning. And they were all over the reef. Here's one of the 3 varieties of lobster. This was the Caribbean spiny lobster, and they were quite large. This is easily a 5-pound lobster. I'm guessing a female. Here's the spotted lobster. As you can see, it's covered in little white spots, and it's quite beautiful. Saw this one on the night dive. Here's a rock crab that's wedged in a rock. A hermit crab crawling through the sand. He hated my light. He would drop his shell if I shone it on him. This was just a small fish that I decided to practice my macro skills on. I only have about a 3-inch focal distance. This is a slipper lobster. It's probably the ugliest thing I've ever seen. I spotted one only on the night dive. Apparently they're quite good to eat. This is a sea cucumber. There were a couple of them out and about on the night dive, not nearly as common as in California. I have absolutely no idea what this gigantic thing is. We spotted 2 of them on the night dive. They were coming out of a hole. No clue. This is a fireworm. You can see the bristles along its sides. If you touch them, they will irritate your skin like crazy and hurt. Here's a small scallop. It was open, but the light closed it. Here's a harlequin shrimp. This was actually the last shot on the last dive of my trip. He was beautiful. I love how it's translucent and the purples and white colors. The highlight of the trip for me was the dives that we did in the Chac Mool Cenotes. The cenotes were stunning. There are two entrances. This is the beginning of the first entrance, and we did one dive here and then another dive in the second entrance. We did this as a cavern dive, so you could always see natural light from wherever you were. There's a predefined rope path that you can see on the center of the camera here. The way it worked was the dive guide led in front, and followed by the least experienced person, and then more and more experiences that went back. One of the things that was really cool to me were the freshwater fish, as these are freshwater fish that I have had in my aquariums over the last 10 years. There was a little Pictus cat of some variety, before that was an Acara, and here's a freshwater eel. To be able to swim in the natural environment where my fish come from was so cool. The caverns were stunning. The way the light danced off the rocks in the fresh water. Here is the halicline. It's where the fresh water of the river mixes with the salt water that's welling up from the ocean, and it produces this really, really blurry effect. There was also a temperature gradient as well. If you were above the halicline, it was a cooler water. Below the halicline, it was the 80 or so degree water of the ocean. As you can see, it just shimmers. It was like you were intentionally blurring your eyes. If you swam behind someone who was stirring it up, it really kind of made it hard to see. But this was just an absolutely amazing experience. This is one of my favorite shots at the cenotes dive. The cenotes offer amazing opportunities for natural light photography. Watch as the light dances with the shadows. These are limestone caverns that have collapsed in to allow access to the underground river system. Here's the entrance or the grotto to the second of the dive sites at this particular cenote. This was the more advanced of the two. He takes you on the first dive to make sure that you can sort of keep your cool, and then you go to this site, where, at least in my opinion, you were far more than 130 linear feet from the surface. But the sights you were greeted with on the second dive were absolutely breathtaking. As you'll see in a moment, there's an air pocket in the back of the cavern that you can go into, and you are mere inches from the stalactites and the stalagmites that have formed over hundreds of thousands of years. Again, you go on a predefined circuit, and the difficulty increases as you go. Here you can start to see that the topography is changing. It's starting to get more and more pristine. You're starting to get more and more of the features that you associate with a cave. You are, in essence, flying through the caves. You are swimming, as you can see, with the stalactites and stalagmites. Now, when the stalactites and the stalagmites are covered with water like this, they're no longer growing. They grow as water that has picked up deposits, filters its way into a cave, and the water leaves the deposits on the ends of the stalactites and the stalagmites. According to our guide, it takes 1,000 years for a stalactite to grow an inch. Here's a fossil brain coral that's in that air pocket that I was telling you about. Here's a fossil seashell in that same air pocket. Here you can see the roots of the plants that are penetrating into the cavern in the air pocket. It's kind of cool to see it spider out. This was absolutely stunning. The stalagmites take 4,000 years to grow an inch. I hope to come back one day and explore other cenotes.